All right, theoretically it's going. Hi everyone, we're about to do a quick audio test and then we'll begin with the actual conversation. Do you want to say something, Mike, so that we can check if you can hear yourself on the other end of the stream? Well, it's probably a good thing. That means that other people will be able to hear you, so go ahead and mute the the Twitch stream. All set? No echo now when you talk? Try talking. All right, we'll wait 5 seconds. You cannot? Oh, interesting. But you did hear an echo. Oh, I was echoing. Oh, it makes sense that I was echoing, but you couldn't hear yourself at all? Okay. Oh, I know why. Okay. I need to turn on... All right, one moment, please. I need to add system audio. All right. Almost done. Then we'll be able to hear you. Still very much a noob with this stuff. All right, unmute your Twitch stream and say something, and we'll see if you can now hear yourself on the stream.
All right, saying something. Test, test, test.
Any luck?
My Twitch stream is just stalled on me here, so I can't tell.
No. Okay. I guess we can only wait and make sure. Keep talking, and hopefully eventually
All right.
the stream will update and you'll hear yourself. Along with my annoying echo. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. All right, I can hear you talking, saying you're almost done. So.
Yeah, it's almost catching up.
Yeah. Okay, I can hear myself on the stream now.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Okay, so mute that stream so you don't hear the annoying echo.
It's muted.
Okay, fantastic. Now we're ready to go. Before we begin, my apologies in advance to you, Mike, and to anyone who might be watching. If I end up yawning at any point, it's because I'm working on about an hour and a half sleep, not because of any remote disinterest. I'm really excited about having this conversation. So anyway, we have with us on the stream today Mike, or Michael Ness, who he's a fellow longtime member of the Amiga community, and also we share a strong interest in something called Amos, which was a basic programming language created on the Amiga specifically for video game creation, and it was created by someone named, his first name is Francois, I think his last name is pronounced Lyonnais, but I could be wrong. I will link to more information and an interview about an interview with Francois soon in the chat, so people can learn more about that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Amos, Mike?
Yeah, sure. First, I want to say hi to everyone, and thanks to you, Mike, for having me on here. It's a pleasure to be on. So I'm working on Amos. A few years ago, Francois released the Amos source code, and a couple of us guys over at the Amos factory got together and have started modifying the source code, fixing bugs, and we have plans now and are implementing them to get Amos up to speed, make it a little more modern, add some of the features that users have been requesting since the last time it was updated, which is 20 years or so. So that's what I've been doing. I think that's why I'm here talking to you about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's really cool for me because as I've mentioned in my previous streams, I'm really interested. I have a very strong love for retro, especially console style and arcade style games in general, but also the Amiga hardware in particular, and always was kind of upset that despite its fantastic hardware and great community, the Amiga has a very unfortunate level of quality, or I should say not a lot of games that not only look great but play on par with classic console and arcade games.
Right.
And so I ended up in the game industry and making games, and I really want to sort of fulfill a long time goal of actually creating a classic Amiga game that actually lives up to classic console and arcade standards, not only visually but actual gameplay wise. Sort of start to give the Amiga the game library it should have had from the beginning, as far as I was concerned.
Right.
And for me, as a non programmer, I mean, I could do a little bit, with BASIC, and later with, not ironically, but interestingly, another product that the same man, Francois, I'll just keep going with my pronunciation, Lyonnais, he, long after Amos for PCs, he started that whole click and create range of game creation software. I think the first one was called the Games Factory, and then now the most current one is called Click Team Fusion 2.5. So I can do stuff with that, and but anyway, back in the Amiga days, it was very exciting for me as someone who was primarily an artist to finally have something unintimidating enough that doesn't require so much investment of time to learn very specific and kind of archaic looking syntax to get things going on the screen. And I was able to start making little demos and stuff like that. And so anyway, it's just very cool it's really cool for such tools to be available. And it's funny, like right now, retro games, retro style, like sort of faux 8-bit and 16-bit games are becoming very popular, especially in the indie game scene. And I think one thing that could be really interesting is taking that even farther and making really legitimate retro style games that actually could run or do run on classic hardware. so that's something I want to explore. I want to see if I can end up making games that can do well and be appreciated in the modern market, that are clearly retro, but at a high enough quality and fun, so that they can make it on their own outside of the niche market of just like hardcore Amiga fans or something like that. So it's exciting to me that while I'm working hard to try to make as high quality stuff I can on a classic system with Amos, that you are helping to make Amos a better environment to create games on. So I really appreciate what you've done so far and what you have planned.
Well, thank you. And I agree with you. I think your vision of this retro gaming concept is amazing. And now's the time.
Yeah, I mean, I really think there's a market for it, and as people might be able to tell, we had a conversation or a few conversations before the stream. So I did want to get more into sort of my long-term goals and what I would love to be a part of, sort of making come to fruition in general. And going back to how this ties into Amos is even going back many years now. It's kind of interesting. I grew up with an older brother who, when we were all living in the same family house with our parents, even in our early teens, I was very much passionate about being a pixel artist and making graphics for games. And my brother, who's almost 2 years older than me, he was learning programming, and we would, especially on the summers, we would rent as many video games as we could, and instead of just playing them like most kids, I'd be pausing it all the time to stare at the graphics to figure out how they did things. And what's interesting is I would always be talking to my brother about the cool hardware banging programming tricks that were used on these consoles to get, the additional parallax effects, or to get giant moving bosses on screen, extra colors on screen, and all of that sort of stuff. So it's been something I've been passionate about for a long time. But anyway, I'm already digressing. Maybe it's from the fatigue, but so that's yeah. Anyway,
No, that's great. I have a similar experience. As a programmer, I enjoyed the games,
right.
But honestly, whenever I played them, it was to figure out, well, how did they code that? What
Yes.
what routines would I have to use to make something like that happen? And I'd go back to Amos at the time, which was my language of choice, and try to do it,
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'd go to the
right.
arcade and see the latest games and just stare in awe at how they could do this.
Right.
So I have a similar experience from a different angle.
Yeah, and that's a really cool thing for me as a sort of creative person, as an artsy fartsy type person, is something really, really interesting about art that seems counterintuitive from the outside, is that a lot of times it's when you have to work within certain supposedly strict confines that you end up making the best, most expressive art. Like, people will think, oh, the most freedom possible, the least limitations possible, the best you do. But it reminds me actually of classical poetry. The fact that you have to work within meter and within rhyme actually makes you spend a lot more time choosing your words and choosing your meter and figuring out the most efficient and powerful way possible to express yourself within
Indeed.
those constraints. And a funny anecdote from back when me and my brother and I were playing these console games. By the time we got to, I think it was on the Sega Saturn, there was a game called, I think it was Die Hard Arcade, and my brother and I loved brawler games like Streets of Rage and Final Fight and things like that. So this was
Yeah.
a supposedly modern 3D sort of brawler game. And what was funny, the game itself, and this started to happen even in the Super Nintendo days, even though most Super Nintendo games were very good, once you got to a point where the consoles could produce some quite impressive graphics and things like that more easily, you started to see a shift where suddenly it was becoming almost more important, especially from a marketing standpoint, to just make the games visually impressive, and it was clear less time and focus was being spent on making the gameplay as good and solid and addictive as possible, and or fun, heaven forbid.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, most SNES games, especially from the main developers and Nintendo themselves, were very good. But I could even see it start to happen then. But then once we got into more modern systems in 3D, more and more of the development cycle and the development cost of top tier games was going into sort of the flashy factor, and less time and effort was being spent on just, suddenly what made the game stand out wasn't that it was fun and innovative from a gameplay and user experience standpoint. It was just, oh, this, spends even more time and money and resources on making really impressive, eventually cinematics. Some modern games, you're watching it more than you're playing it.
True.
And so it was just so anyway, the thing about this game on the, I think it was the Saturn, while the game was loading, because it was a CD based game, the loading time was pretty terrible. In order to make that more bearable, they included, I forget which company, it may have been Namco, I can't remember, but they included one of their classic, like, 2-bit, maybe it was 4-bit or 8-bit, I don't know, but very, very primitive arcade game that I think was called something like Deep Scan. It was a little submarine game where you're a submarine under the water and you're deploying there's what do you call it, like battleships up above on the surface of the water going
Sure.
across, and they're dropping depth charges that are slowly floating down at you, and you have to dodge them, and you have to shoot missiles upward to try to destroy them. And what's funny was that simple game was more fun. So we literally, at one point, when we just got fed up with all of the poor game design choices of the game that we actually paid the money for, this Die Hard arcade game, we were just like, screw it, reset. Like, once it finished loading, we were like, reset so it has to reload again so we can play I think it was Deep Scan again.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So it just goes to show you, like, when you have to work within limitations, you pay more attention. Like in the case of pixel art, every pixel counts, every color you use counts, every frame of animation counts, and when you can't just wow people with production value, then you have to really spend more time making sure that the game itself, the core of the game, has something to offer. Is it fun? Is it somehow fun in a way that's different than all the other games that are out there? And to me, that's one of the beautiful things about making retro style games this day and age, is it brings it back. Like, even a very small team, even myself working on a game alone with something like Amos or Multimedia Fusion, as soon as people see pixel art, automatically their standards adjust to that level. So even a very small team in a fairly constricted amount of time can actually make a game that looks good, that they look at it and they go, oh wow, that's really nice. They can appreciate it within that sort of visual paradigm. Suddenly they're not expecting cinematic quality cutscenes and all of this.
Sure.
So it's really interesting, and then you're back to focusing on the overall design and, more importantly, the gameplay. So anyway, that's something that I was thinking about, like with the popularity of games like Shovel Knight and things like that, which are very good games, but they're sort of faux retro. They're half retro. They're using sort of like
Right.
the 8-bit Nintendo color palette, but they're using a higher resolution and far more moving objects on screen and particle effects and lots of layers of scrolling and stuff. So one thing that I want to do is creating retro games that at the very least could be done or could be ported to classic systems and actually run, or even better, what I'm hoping to eventually get at is have a development system for not just myself but anyone that's interested in making a retro style game, where they're creating a game that they can sell on modern markets and platforms, but also the game would actually run on classic hardware. And this is where I
Yeah.
think the Amiga comes in, because like ability wise, to me the Amiga hits like the perfect sweet spot, like as far as overall color palette, on screen number of colors, overall like how many moving objects it can have on screen. It's like right there, right in between like the higher end TurboGrafx 16, the Mega Drive, and the Super Nintendo. And so like it fits right in there so well. Like the screen I have on my desktop is from a demo that I was working on with CodeTapper that actually can run with lots of parallax scrolling. You can see it in my previous stream. It can run on a classic Amiga. So I mean, I hope that proves that like you could do very games that just fit right in visually with the higher caliber Mega Drive and even Super Nintendo games. And to me, that's like the perfect sweet spot for 16-bit retro. And the difference is, there's a lot of Amiga computers and CD-TVs and CD32 consoles out there. And a lot of them are probably collecting dust, and it would be so cool to be able to release games that not only can modern players who have no interest in the Amiga play on modern systems, but all of the people that actually own Amigas can take them out, brush off the dust, and have a whole new gaming experience with a game that sort of really not only feels very nostalgic, but also is just fulfilling that fantasy of what Amiga games should have been, but
Indeed.
never quite achieved for several reasons. The two that stand out to me, as I mentioned in the previous stream, is there was just a less serious attitude toward video games as an art form in the West in general as compared to Japan back then. And that led to two things. That led to publishers not investing enough time or big enough teams to work on games or ports, and then simultaneously Commodore themselves, until the CD TV, which was prohibitively expensive for most people. They expected everyone to play video games using clunky one-button joysticks
Right.
from the Atari days, which is pretty ridiculous. I mean, once the 8-bit Nintendo and the Sega Master System came out with their 2-button control pads, that should have been a wake-up call for everyone.
Yes.
And it's really pretty embarrassing, and the Amiga game library really suffers almost more than anything else from that one simple thing, that until the CD-TV and then the CD32, there was really almost no support for like reasonably modern input devices or control pads.
Right.
So that's one thing that we had briefly discussed that you were going to be hopefully introducing to Amos, is like built-in support for the CD32 controller, so that
Right.
people can make Amiga games with. Did you want to say more about that?
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, you had given me some code in Amos, in fact, to read the CD32 joystick from Amos, but having that integrated would just, I think, would just make it all the better, right?
Oh, that's for sure. Yeah.
And there are other things too. I mean, when Francois originally wrote Amos, the joystick, just you can tell by the way the instructions are handled, was just expected to be a one-button digital joystick. But the Amiga can handle other styles of joysticks, even the original, like analog joysticks and multi-button joysticks.
Right.
So having support for that, as well as the CD32 specifically,
Right.
that controller would be excellent, I think.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, yeah, and for those who don't know, the CD32 controller was extremely similar in button layout to the Super Nintendo. It had two shoulder buttons. It had four what you could call action buttons, or four typical control pad buttons in a diamond pattern, just like the Super Nintendo. I think it only had a start button and not a select and a start. Am I remembering that wrong? I think so.
I guess I don't know. I think it did, yeah.
Yeah.
A start one.
And then a D-pad, which unfortunately, even once they finally made a legitimate control pad, the D-pad they went with in the design and manufacturing was horribly spongy and inaccurate for games. So
Right.
unfortunately, they didn't learn that lesson properly from from the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive or Genesis controllers. But at least finally, there was a controller that was adequate and had a nice amount of buttons, and then it also proved the case that, I mean, you could take the CD32 controller and plug it into your classic Amiga from nearly a decade before, and with the proper coding, it could detect every last one of those buttons. So there
Right.
really was no excuse all of that time why they didn't have a
No.
decent controller all the way back then.
That's true. Although from a coding perspective, just the style of coding changed.
Right.
From the 80s to the 90s, the CD32 controller uses more of what we now call like a bit stream
Right.
approach, as opposed to just checking specific bits on a specific port number or specific address,
Right.
which is what the original code in Amos did.
Right.
So it's a different way of thinking. I can understand why it was done that way most of the time, but there really is no excuse
Right.
in the 90s, at least,
So,
to not getting better at that.
as a much less technically knowledgeable person than you, I'm assuming it seems like what you're saying is originally it was much more like direct, sort of on-off, like with that 9-pin plug, it was sending data like, is the one button being pressed or not being pressed, and the same thing for up, down, left, and right. Whereas
Correct.
the buttons on a CD32 computer, it might be sending almost like a Morse code pattern for each button, so it has to sort of
Right.
detect a sort of signature pattern instead of just on or off. Is that basically
Correct.
Okay.
Right. You set a certain bit on the controller
Right.
and the hardware, and it changes what's being received in the other bits sent through the wire. And so that allows you, when that bit is off, it would read the D-pad,
Mm-hmm.
and then when it's on, it'll read the buttons. That's
Okay.
that's simplistic, but
Right.
that's the idea.
I gotcha. So it's sort of combining sort of layers of information at the same time.
Correct.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so yeah, going back to my long-term sort of goals or dream, like I really think it's important that everyone that's involved in supporting or working on something, that it's much more likely that a project will be successful if you can figure out a way for it to be for there to be a payoff every step of the way. So that's part of why I started the stream. I'm hoping that that everything we do and everything we talk about in steps is entertaining at least to some people, but then also encouraging, informative, and also exposes people to or actually introduces or creates new tools that will empower people. So going back to several years ago, I made a demo in Amos that shows that you can actually, with very careful layout of a color palette by the artist, and then controlling which bit planes you blit, which sort of layers of data that you draw onto the screen, you can actually create a translucency effect somewhat similar to the Super Nintendo's translucency effects on classic Amigas. And that's cool because theoretically the Amiga doesn't have any like hardware support for that. So one would think, oh, if you tried to do a translucency effect, it would have to do all kinds of computing to figure out, oh, what color should I draw if I'm trying to overlay one color over the other, and it would be very slow. And what's cool about this method is it's actually faster, so you're getting a cool translucency effect, but you're doing so by drawing less bit planes per moving object. So it's actually faster, and just because you've invested a little time in setting up your palette properly and drawing your art properly for those objects, you get not only a free cool special effect, but your game might actually run slightly faster as opposed to as if all the objects were solid. And so by making that demo and releasing it to the Amos community and the Amiga community at large, I'm just hoping that even if one other person that is working on a game sees that and realizes how easy it is, they can improve the overall quality of their game very effortlessly. And so that's what I really hope to do, is to just keep introducing and making more and more accessible workflows and tools that will help everyone make like really authentic retro games, especially on the Amiga, because that's like really, in my opinion, the platform not only perfect for it, but that needs it the most. So that's I don't want to ramble too long without giving you a chance to also talk.
Oh no,
but
that's fine.
Yeah.
I'd like to echo but just reiterate one of the points that you had said earlier about how you felt the Amiga was the sweet spot among these other consoles, which I find ironic considering that, you know, it was built originally 4 years before the Mega Drive, and you know, many years before some of these other consoles. Right. So the fact that it could hold its own as a sweet spot among these older brothers, if you will, or younger brothers, I'm sorry, is a testament to something.
Yeah, and what really makes that interesting is the fact that the hardware designers of the Amiga, for sure, were very visionary, and they did have a video game console in mind from day one when they started designing not solely a game console, but they wanted something that sort of could do it all. It could be a great home computer and like a really advanced home arcade game console. And what's interesting is this approach they decided to take, which was incredibly different to every other console I've ever heard of, which was you know, every other console relied on sprites for moving objects, and therefore invested, by the time of the TurboGrafx-16 or the Mega Drive or the Super Nintendo, they added specialized hardware, sprite chips in the consoles that could really do a lot, you know, draw a lot of colorful, fast-moving objects on screen. And what's interesting about the Amiga is they went the exact opposite direction, and they put all of the eggs in the blitter basket, which is a totally different approach where you have a dedicated part of the hardware that can basically manipulate the quote-unquote background graphics, like the same colors being used in the background layer, a blitter processor or chip, I guess, or just a blitter process in general, can draw into the background and create moving objects. And the sort of benefit to that is there's not a limit to how many blitter objects you can have per scan line or raster line, however you want to say it, per horizontal line on the screen. You don't end up with that flickering effect that you do on console games when too many moving objects end up on the same horizontal line. Of course, there are downsides to that too, which is very interesting to talk about. That's why so many people don't think that, especially people that grew up mostly with the Mega Drive, and then they see Amiga games, especially the Amiga games that are sort of ports or trying to be like Mega Drive games using the same methodology, and the Amiga games just look inferior, and they just write off the Amiga as a really cobbled Mega Drive. And on paper, it sort of is, if you ignore the fact that it has a blitter chip that those games aren't really using. Right. Like, in other words, if you use the Amiga sort of out of the box, like you're using a programming for a console, and you want layered scrolling, so you use the Amiga's built-in support for that dual playfield mode, which gives you two separate scrolling layers, but now each layer can only be 7 colors plus transparent, which obviously is extremely limiting, far more limiting than the Mega Drive's ability for layered scrolling. And then if you do that, with the Amiga, you only start to begin with 8 3-color sprites per scan line, and that gets reduced down to something like 7 or 6 once you introduce dual playfield mode or hardware scrolling of the layers. So your already very limited sprites become insanely limited compared to something, which is why you have games that otherwise look on par from a technical standpoint, like Mr. Nuts, I forget the full name of the game, on the Amiga. Like, the programmer and the artists were obviously very, very skillful, very, very dedicated people to making a high-quality game, but because they used the Amiga hardware virtually exactly the same way that they would have used the Mega Drive, they were hit with these severe color limitations and didn't come up with creative ways around that. So you ended up with, you've got a 7-color foreground, and then every moving object, like enemies, explosions, pickup gems, they all have to use those same 7 colors. Like, luckily, there's just enough sprites that typically when people did make a game like that on the Amiga, they could make the player character a sprite, a 16-color sprite. So you had, a 7-color back layer, 7-color foreground layer, and like all the enemies would use those same 7 colors, all the pickup items would use those same 7 colors, but then you would have at least a nice, colorful Mega Drive quality player character. But like, those are the instances where someone uses the Amiga sort of out of the box, sort of ignoring the blitter for the most part, and this is sort of how the Amiga got a sort of bad reputation as just being inferior to the Mega Drive to a far greater degree than it was, and there were not enough games out there that showed what the Amiga could do that the Mega Drive could not do, which would be stuff using the blitter. It is because that it focuses on blitting that the translucency effect that I mentioned was possible, which would not have been possible, as far as I know, on the Mega Drive, or certainly not to the same extent. Obviously, the classic Amigas could display a much broader overall color palette, picking from 4,096 colors instead of 512 total colors, and then so anyway, I could go on about all this stuff, but it's anyway. My whole point is, to me, like, just as a creative person that likes sort of working within limitations, but figuring out ways to sort of use those limitations to my advantage, and like, really, like, figure out, like, how can I overcome the supposed limitation? How can I create the illusion that there's far more going on? Like, how can I get more colors on screen, both
Right.
actually or just visually? Like, how can I create the illusion of more colors on screen? And what can really be done to create lots of layers of scrolling and cool visual effects and things like that. And so anyway, my whole point about this is being like, I really think there could be a very strong pull to a lot of up and coming game developers or established game developers that want a more interesting challenge to work developing a modern game that actually legitimately runs on antique hardware, basically.
Indeed.
And yeah, I think the Amiga is perfect for that, and I really want to make the development platform options for Amiga as attractive as possible to people that are going to start up another game making project.
So while you were talking there,
Yeah.
just a story came to my mind recently. So at my day job, I'm a compiler developer, and one of the tasks that I was given a couple of years ago was to work on some optimizations for, at that time it was a new chip by Intel called the Knight's Landing, and now I think they're onto another chip called Skylake or something like that. These are specialized chips that they use. And one of the instructions they have is they call it ternary logic. And as I was working through how to use this instruction in their assembler to optimize certain codes, I've realized that I'd seen this before. And sure enough, when I went and looked back at my Amiga hardware manual, the ternary logic code was actually verbatim the logic code from the blitter chip.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe it. I was wow,
that's really cool.
this makes sense. It just, I don't know, a little anecdote for you that what's old is new again.
Yeah, no, it's certain concepts are sort of timeless, and
Right.
Sort of their usefulness goes beyond their function where they originally appeared.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's very cool. I'm currently just playing silently on my screen the original Amiga demo, Amos demo that was used to show off the abilities of Amos. And you can see this would run on a classic Amiga 1000 or 500, and or you'll see it 5 seconds from now on the stream anyway.
Right.
You can see, like, this is the blitter chip. This is only, like I said, 7-color. Go back a little bit. 7-color foreground playfield, but as you can see, you can pretty much plaster the screen with very large moving objects. Which is something that, if the Mega Drive tried to display that many moving objects as sprites, there would certainly be quite a bit of flicker going on.
Right.
So, yeah, and you wouldn't be able to, not that that demo used any, but, you could use translucency effects that the Mega Drive isn't capable of, at least as far as I know. But I've certainly never seen a Mega Drive game use it. But anyway, I've just got the demo going. It's showing some collision detection stuff.
It's been a long time since I've seen that demo. It's really, really cool to see again.
Yeah. So yeah,
the flying hot dogs.
I do remember seeing this demo before I got Amos itself, and I just got really excited that I would have control over these game specific things, to actually be able to try to make a game on the Amiga without having to learn C or assembly code or anything.
Right.
So yeah, very very empowering. I really owe Francois, however you pronounce his last name, a huge gratitude for uh, Amos and then Fusion had a massive impact, not only uh, inspiring and empowering me, but a lot of the things that I learned using those things were critical in my becoming more attractive an applicant into the game industry. It was
Right.
that skill set. Like it was a big deal to the companies that I ended up working for, that I could not only create art, but I could actually prototype working interfaces and proof of concept gameplay extremely quickly without needing to take programmers' time out of busy projects, as obviously
Yeah.
deadlines are really important. So, yeah, it was a big deal. Um, in the Amiga in general, I learned, I mastered, or to the extent that I'm a master, I certainly got fast at it. I learned my skills as a pixel artist on the Amiga. Most people going back long enough remember the classic painting program Deluxe Paint, either for PCs or the Amiga. And there
Yep.
was a program that came out later called Brilliance, which really was uh, fantastic, in my opinion. Sort of the next step beyond Deluxe Paint as far as the user interface and the workflow that it allowed for.
Sure.
Just a fantastic program. But anyway, nowadays I do most of my pixel art on a program that was clearly strongly influenced by Deluxe Paint and Brilliance on PCs called ProMotion. The newest version is called ProMotion NG. Full transparency, my company now is the publisher of that program on Steam.
Oh.
But so um, we get a small percentage of sales from that. So just putting that out there so people know. But at the same time, I've been using that program exclusively for pixel art for over a decade. So I sort of befriended and proposed the idea. Befriended him for I think over a decade now, and then once we became Steam publishers, I offered to help him get ProMotion on Steam because I loved the program so much.
Yeah.
So in other words, I'm not recommending or plugging or speaking the praises of the program because I'm the publisher on Steam, but because it's a fantastic program that I've been using for over a decade.
Right.
And it also, aside from my experience on the Amiga and with things like Amos and then Fusion, it was that program allowed me to develop workflow that allowed me to produce artwork faster than pretty much all of my coworkers. So that was in the actual industry, deadlines are a huge part of it. It's not just about creating the best, most impressive, most beautiful art for any given thing. It's about producing professional level art as fast as possible. So anyway, all that aside, I think it would be good to, I'll just very quickly go into my Amiga emulation and show one of the most recent Amos projects I'm working on. And then I'll quickly show a workflow that I use using ProMotion and the other product that my company has had created and publishes, which is called Sprite, to create pixel art for this Amiga project. So I'm just going to go into ProMotion right now. How's is my voice breaking up at all, or is everything good so far?
No, it's been
excellent.
crystal clear here so far.
Fantastic. Okay.
How about mine?
Yeah, perfect. No complaints.
Excellent. I think the delay is a little longer than I expected here.
Yeah, definitely seems like a long delay.
On Twitch, I'm running probably 15 or 20 seconds behind you.
Right. Hopefully it won't cause too much confusion, but...
No.
Alright, so... And I'm going slow, partly because of fatigue, but let's see. Alright. I'm going to start running it just so I can show people. I got my controller here. So this should run in theory on any classic Amiga. And I showed this off a bit on the previous stream in case people want to see more info on it. But all of the moving objects are done with the blitter method I mentioned. The sort of translucent column that goes in front of the player, that's using the few Amiga sprites to create a better layered scrolling effect. And then the actual game screen where the moving objects can go is in 16 color mode, and then there's another 16 color screen being used for that parallax effect for the floor and the ceiling that are scrolling faster to create the illusion of depth. And then if you look very carefully on the exhaust of the robot, you can see it's using one of the transparent modes or translucent modes you can use to make the flame show a little bit of the background detail through it. So anyway, so what I wanted to show quickly was sort of workflow I used. The next step I'm going to take in this game is adding a little bit of a tweened animation for the robot so that when you're going forward, he leans forward into the movement, and when you go back, he leans back a bit to give it a much more lively and natural look, so it's not just a static sort of cardboard cutout of a robot flying around. It'll actually feel a lot more like a real thing with moving parts in a sort of three-dimensional space. So I'm going to show you my workflow for that in a second.
Very cool.
Oops. Alright, so I'm clicking a lot of wrong buttons here.
It's okay. Update for you. I'm about a minute behind. I timed it out here.
Wow. Alright, so alright. Let's see. Nope, I don't know if the microphone's picking that up, but my stomach just growled. Let's see here.
Time for breakfast.
Yeah. So, just looking for the file now, actually. Okay, so I created the... Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say while you're doing that, I was looking at this gameplay. It's still going on for me, and I love it. Love this gameplay. It's great.
Thanks, yeah, and it's going to put full use to, or to at least have full support for the CD32 control pad. Any other buttons, you'll actually be able to transform eventually back and forth between a spaceship and the robot, which will affect the gameplay. Obviously, you'll have a smaller, like this is, you're not going to see it for a full minute, but let me zoom in on it here. It's all blurry because I'm not in a pixel art program to do the zooming, but when you become the spaceship, you'll be able to move faster and you have a smaller overall size, so it's easier to dodge between shots. And your sort of weapon shooting pattern will also be different. And so basically there'll be strategic reasons why you want to transform at different times in the gameplay.
Interesting.
So the transform will probably be on one of the shoulder buttons by default or something, and then different buttons will activate different weapons, or sort of change your, for example, maybe one button will change whether or not you're shooting in a sort of wide spray pattern or a focused forward, to do more damage to one particular enemy as opposed to just sort of a spray
Sure.
to take out a lot of weak enemies all at once on the screen. So anyway, what I wanted to show you was how I started. Okay, so I'll load that image in ProMotion, the program I was just mentioning. So when I'm creating a game, the first thing I do, aside from coming up with the general ideas, is I just create a screen, usually at the actual resolution of, let's see if I have such a file. Hold on a second. There we go. Okay. So this is how my mock-up ended up looking once all the art was finished. But basically I create layers in ProMotion so that I can start creating each art asset separately. And I use a method called blocking in, whereas instead of creating your art by starting with detailed line art, which is very time consuming and sort of creatively constrictive because it's so cerebral, like to do line art you really have to know what you're drawing ahead of time for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Blocking in is using a big brush. You'll see this a minute too late, but the idea is you make a relatively big brush with a solid color and you're drawing the actual shape in instead of drawing careful outlines to delineate shape. And there's no details. You're just basically creating things with blobs of color.
Yeah.
So
I saw your first Twitch stream on this. This was excellent.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, so it allows you to work much faster, and you can develop the entire look of the game much more quickly. And you can just keep swapping between layers and tweak your background, and very easy to tweak the color scheme, the lighting style, and everything of all your game elements all at once. So it's a much nicer way, much quicker way to arrive at the final look of the game. And you end up with final art assets that you're ready to then expand upon. And then for pixel art, I really recommend that people work at first in the actual desired final resolution to do the mock-up, because if you design things, and I've seen people make this mistake so many times, like let's say, I need to design a really cool robot like this robot here. If I zoom in on this robot, there's actually very little detail. It looks highly detailed when I zoom out, but if you zoom in, the actual level of detail is very limited, and this is going to become really obvious when I show you sort of the next step. But so anyway, the people can waste a huge amount of time and actually end up with a final design that doesn't reduce well to the required actual resolution. Like, it's so easy if you're working really big, if you're just like a traditional artist or concept artist and you're designing characters for a pixel art game, if in your mind you're just going, okay, I'm just going to do this really cool detailed drawing of this cool character, and it's very easy to start going crazy with the level of detail and really putting lots of intricate things that either is never going to be able to be reproduced in the pixel art version, or is just going to turn the pixel art version into a big mess of confetti, just a big dither spray of pixels. So
Right.
It's really important for pixel artists to learn that by far the most important thing is the silhouette, which is another reason why this blocking in method is so great, because you're focused right from the get-go entirely on silhouette. And then what you really need is a few interesting shapes and really important thought to contrast, so that people can very easily distinguish, okay, what are the back limbs versus the front limbs, and like what is the chest, what is the head, things like that.
Right.
So in other words, focusing on fewer shapes and making sure they're all very interesting shapes and that they work together in very interesting ways is how a pixel artist needs to think. Whereas a concept artist for modern high-res games, they can worry a lot more about actual fashion design and what kind of fabric this looks like it's made out of, and what kind of stitching this jacket seems to have, and what's embroidered on it. And those are details that are for designing pixel art in classic style game sprites. It's actually counterproductive. It's great after the fact for marketing art to take. Like, that's how you should work. You should design the sprite first in the actual resolution, and then once that's perfect, then you can either yourself do high resolution, high detailed concept art based on those basic forms, or have a concept artist do that. But that way you're doing something that looks like, oh, it's just a blown up version of the pixel art, and now I can see those details that I couldn't see before, as opposed to something being designed in a way that it would just not make nice pixel art. So anyway, I hope that wasn't too long of a lecture about the sort of mindset of making pixel art. So anyway, the whole point is I made this whole mock-up at actual resolution, and then I knew I wanted to create these sort of smoothly tweened animations of the character leaning into moving forward and leaning back to go backward. And a traditional workflow might be to actually hand pixel draw, which I have done for years, like just hand pixel draw each new frame, which is a very painstaking process, as you can imagine. So a workflow that works really well, what I did instead was I took the so I took this character image. Why didn't that grab? Oh, there we go. Okay, so I took this character image and I enlarged it to 4 times the size, like this, and this just uses nearest neighbor scaling, so it stays. It doesn't add new colors or get blurry or anything. It just gets really blocky. It looks like it's made out of Legos now. And then what I did was I started a whole process. Let me see if I still have the file. Theoretically, it's here. Okay, Spriter parts. Okay, here it is. So what I did was I then loaded this image separately of this enlarged robot, and I broke it up. I literally grabbed each piece, like the head and the arm, and I gave it its own layer, and I started just cleaning it up, but cleaning it up in a way where I got rid of the fact that it looked like it was made out of Legos, but I kept the same level of detail. So I was making it less jagged, but I was not adding any additional detail. So you can see how very undetailed the actual design of the mech is. But what's important is I know my end goal is shrinking this back down to quarter size so that it's the actual size I need. And if I wasted time thinning the outlines and adding details inside, those are either going to disappear or actually look pretty crappy once I reduce it back down. You'll just get that grainy confetti effect going in your art, which obviously you don't want for what should be a nice, smooth, metallic robot. So let me close this stuff out now, and I will go into Spriter and show you what I did next. And I apologize for the fact that you're hearing me talk and then 1 full minute later seeing what I'm doing. That shouldn't be the case for the people watching the stream, but unfortunately, you have to suffer.
It's just me. Yeah. The anticipation is building.
Yes, indeed. So now I'm in Spriter, which you'll see. And in Spriter, I took those separate pieces that I had made in ProMotion of the enlarged pieces, and I reassembled them here in Spriter. I saved them all out as separate images from ProMotion, each layer, and then I reassembled it into Spriter, and I added a bone system, a skeletal system, and then assign those images to the appropriate bones. And now I can freely change the position of the character extremely easily, and I can create animations that tween between different poses. So I just started by creating my standard sort of, if the robot is not moving at all and the player is not pushing forward or pushing back, if the robot is just sort of floating there, I created that pose first, and then I created a more extreme position for when the robot is flying backward. So he's really leaning back a lot. And then, as you can see, Sprite tweens that for you, or you will see soon anyway, Mike. Everybody else.
Yeah.
But anyway, so this allowed me, after the initial work of cleaning up those large pieces and reassembling it, now I can create very natural, smooth animations very, very quickly. And I could obviously do very extreme things that would take a really long time in pixel art. Like I could really make this character lean completely forward, arches back, straighten out his arms. You'll see this all soon, but you can make very drastically different frames with almost no effort. And then, so here's the cool part. So once I was done with that, I made sure I switched Spriter's mode. I turned off smooth sampling, and I turned on pixel art mode. And what this did was make sure that when I export the frames that I've created in Spriter, they'll be exported without adding any additional blurriness or additional colors to the image. So then I just
That's cool.
So then I just exported, and this is the cool thing, because they're tweened animations, I can decide based on how much memory I want to gobble up on the Amiga for any particular animation. I could export every animation as 2 frames or 100 frames. It doesn't matter, and it's going to give me a nice smooth transition of that movement from frame to frame. So, like if I need to, for example, if I'm working on this game and at first I'm sort of overzealous and I use too many frames of animation, but then later on I realize, I'm running out of memory and I really want to fit in another enemy or a boss or something, then I could always go back and re-export my animation using fewer frames. So anyway, so I just export however smooth a frame rate I want. I export those as sequential images, and then once I have those, I then can load those back into Promotion, the pixel art program. So now I will load this image back up. This has my base palette, but I don't want to use these colors, which are part of the background stuff. So what I'm doing right now, just so you know, you'll see it eventually, is blackening out the colors that were in that mock-up image that were used for the background, because I want a nice clean palette that matches the actual 16 colors that I can use for the robot character. So now that I did that, I could load in one of these new animation frames I created. So I'll drag this into Promotion, and I'll just use the standard options for remapping it down to 256 color. And so there it is. I'm going to grab this as a brush, go back to the actual pixel art reference, and now I'm going to choose color, remap colors, brush, and now I have this giant version of the new frame. And now if I press H once, that's going to cut it down to half the size. Press H one more time, now it's the actual size. of the original pixel art. It just so happens I loaded in almost exactly the same frame as the original idle, but you can see, or you'll see in about a minute, the just sort of algorithmically reduced version of the sprite looks almost exactly the same as the original low-res pixel art sprite I had made in the first place. So I'm going to have to do an incredibly small amount of hand pixel cleanup to finalize all of these frames of animation for the robot. So
That's really
it's
cool.
an incredibly fast workflow. And obviously for animations like leaning forward, leaning back, and things like walking and running, this is incredibly effective because for the most part, for animations like that, there's not a lot of 3D tilting or rotation of any of the body parts. They're just sort of sideways facing. You just rotate the bones and it looks right.
Yeah.
You can't use this method as directly for complicated things, like if you wanted your character to, like, you know, rotate in 360 or like do a rotating 360 uppercut or something, then obviously a lot more hand drawing would be required for that type of animation. But a very large percent of the animations that you typically need to create for a side-scrolling game, you can use this method and it'll save you a massive amount of time. So yeah, it's
Well, this is pretty cool.
Yep, we'll see it in a minute.
I know. It just from what I'm seeing right now, it's
Yeah.
the workflow looks amazing.
So now that we're done with that, going back to Amos, you have a lot more experience than I do with one of the tools that comes with Amos, which is also programmed in Amos, if I recall.
Yes.
That is specifically to help you to grab images from a sprite sheet and sort of prepare them to get them ready for use in Amos for your game objects, which would be to designate how they're trimmed out of the sprite sheet and then set a hotspot for each image.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm going to want to do next in that project. Now that once I add these images to the sprite sheet, I'll want to actually switch to using the official tool and creating an actual sprite bank or blitter image bank with that tool. So if you have the time and energy left, I would love if you would show me how to do that.
Of course.
Okay, so let's see if we can get this working. See if
Hold on one moment. Let me share my screen here and see if that works for you.
And to save your bandwidth, it might be a good idea to just close the Twitch stream that you are watching.
Okay.
Since now my screen is going to be your screen anyway.
All right, I'll close that now.
Okay.
All right, I'm sharing the screen.
Okay.
Let me know when you see it.
Drag that on. And let's see if I can figure out how to magnify this thing. All right. We are all set.
Excellent. Okay, let me start my emulator here. All right, so it's booting up in WinUAE right now. Tell me if you see.
Yep, I sure do. It looks
See
crystal
this.
clear too.
All right. Okay, so this is not nearly as colorful as what we've just witnessed, but let me pull this up. Pull up Amos. I think I'll, so you can see here I've got my Amos Pro folder from the original install, but over here, I'll show it to you here, is the beta that we have of the Amos Pro 2.10, which is some bug fixes that a gentleman named Bruce Uncle from the Amos factory has put together and compiled into Amos. We have a release of this 2.10 version pending. Bruce has he has a couple bug fixes to put in and a few more features that he'd like to add. So I don't have an exact time frame, but
Right.
I'm hoping to get an official release here, shortly.
Yeah.
But I'll just give you a little preview here. It's nothing amazing, but if you've used Amos before, you'll notice a few differences. So you can see they redesigned the little Amos logo here. Colors are a little bit different. Menus are also a little different. At least some of them over here. Anyway, the tool that we want to use here is in the user menu. It's called Object Ed. And I think when we've talked previously, you mentioned that the interface that was created here isn't exactly intuitive.
Right. That was my problem.
Right.
And I could only find tutorials online that were not in English, so it made it very difficult for me. And unfortunately, I no longer have an Amos manual, although I don't even recall if they explained how to use these in the manual. I assume they did, but maybe not.
I don't recall either. I think they did have a section on it. I don't think I've ever read it. I think I probably just dove in.
Right.
But this interface here shows what was one of the very new features in Amos Pro back 20 some odd years ago, the interface language that allowed you to make pop-up boxes and just dialog boxes and stuff like that.
Right.
So I think it was a little bit ahead of its time even for now. All right. So I'm just going to go through some of the menus at the top. Actually, yeah. Let me give you a layout here of the bottom first. Okay, so coming from ProMotion, this is archaic. But here we have the main drawing window right here in the left-hand side, along with your color palette over on the very left. Up here, these three things are your current selected color, like foreground color and background color. I don't remember what the third one is. Over on the right-hand side of the screen, this shows the current bank of images that's loaded. Amos calls these sprite banks,
Right.
bob banks, or icon banks for like background images and such.
Right. Just for people who don't know, a bob was a blitter drawn object. So it was,
Right.
What was it? Blitter object. What did bob stand for?
I believe it was just blitter object. The
Blitter
first B is
object.
for
Okay.
blitter, and
Right.
then
OB
bob.
for object. Gotcha.
Right.
Okay.
So, and there's some drawing tools up here at the top. Again, pretty rudimentary stuff. Here's a,
Right. So people can theoretically use this tool alone if they hate themselves. They can create all of their required sprite art right within this one program.
Exactly.
This is part of Amos.
Some of this is really odd. I mean,
Yeah.
coming from D-Paint here, you can draw a line, and then
it keeps that line as a brush.
keeps
so
that line around, and you
stamp it
can.
down.
It's very different from
Yeah.
D-Paint.
It makes a lot of sense for workflow. Like, it's a pretty cool idea,
Sure.
as long as you can get back to drawing with a single pixel very easily. But
Right.
yeah, I've actually never seen that in another program, and it's pretty elegant, but it certainly would be confusing the first time it happens.
Right.
And
Yeah,
I
know
assume
it's
there's a way to change the overall, like I can see here in this case, by default it's 48 by 64 pixels.
Right.
I assume there's a way to change the quote-unquote canvas size for each frame. Oh, it's that simple. Okay, you change it over there, and now every frame in the bank is going to be that size. Is that the case?
No. The frames can be different sizes.
Oh, that's good.
So, I'll show that. Well,
Right.
I'll show that a little bit later when we get to extracting
Okay.
images. But yeah, the images themselves can be compacted if it's a small object, and larger if it's a big object. So you can do some cutting, make brushes and such.
So how come there are two scissor icons? What is the difference between the two?
Good question. I believe that one of them cuts
I see.
and just keeps it, and the other one, hold on. Okay.
Oh, maybe that restores the brush that you have.
Yeah, it restores the brush.
Okay.
I'm not sure if there's a right button action on there. I'm trying it right now. No. Like in Deluxe Paint, if you right-click while you grab a brush, it will
cut it instead of just
it'll cut it, right? Exactly. So this doesn't have that, but it's still somewhat powerful, actually. I'm not entirely certain what these two things do. Here you can flip image.
That's certainly handy if you're if you need your character to have both left and right facing animations. Like you could load in one, and I assume you can copy a bank and then or copy a frame and then quickly create a flipped version.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Amos does have the ability to flip a single image as well, like on the fly.
Right.
So you don't necessarily even have to have the multiple images in the sprite bank.
Right. I would assume on classic Amigas, if you tried doing that with a robustly animated entire character sprite, you might end up with some performance hit.
I believe so.
Yeah.
I believe so. I guess I don't know the details of that implementation yet, but when I do, then
I actually used that feature, and it was beautiful for a Street Fighter style character select screen, where it had a very large, like you would pick the character from a roster of characters, just little head portraits up at the top. But then whichever character you were picking, there was a very large full torso portrait close-up of the character. So there was like a versus in the middle, and then the player 1 would be on the left, player 2 would be on the right. And the player 2 on the right, all of the large versions of the character he was selecting were horizontally flipped compared to how it would look if player 1 chose the same character. So that way I could have a really nice look where like the portraits of the characters are facing each other with the verses in the middle, but I only needed the memory of the only facing from, to the right. And it worked very well, but at that time I only had an actual Amiga 1200, so it was the AGA more powerful chipset. So I have no idea how well that would have run, like how much of a frame rate hit it would have taken, because it was flipping those giant portraits on the fly every time you chose a new character for player 2.
Right. I remember the documentation in Amos made a pretty big deal about this ability.
Yeah.
I don't recall how much of a performance hit it would take.
Yeah, I could say that screen, which was 32 color, ran very well, and I had several animated objects on screen and these giant 32 color portraits. And for a it was a CD32, in fact, with an what's it called, SX1, to turn it into an A1200.
Oh yeah, right.
But anyway, it ran very well, even with very large objects being flipped. But I'm just guessing, like if you tried that with an A500 and you were trying to do a game like Final Fight or Streets of Rage or something with like 5 or 6 largely animated characters on screen, and half of them were being flipped at any one time, I would guess there would be a performance hit. But
I would too, but maybe Code Tapper would be the man to ask about that trick. I don't know.
Or I would just create a quick benchmark test that wouldn't take too long to see what happens when you just flip, suddenly flip half of the objects or all of the objects on screen. But anyway.
All right. Well, I mean, those are the main tools. I don't really know what the M does here. It's probably in the manual.
Right.
Or the 1 and 2 buttons. But the rest of these are
So,
fairly self-explanatory.
right. One thing I did notice, like, I assume that E stands for empty in the bank. So I assume after you draw
Yes.
something, you have to do something to actually put it
Correct.
into the first frame. So how do you do that?
Okay. Well, let's just draw a nice little box. And we'll want to...
Oh, I don't know if the microphone is picking this up, but the apartment directly below me is recently vacant, and the owners are having it completely renovated. So
Oh, wow.
at some point we might get some very loud construction noises, and if that starts happening, I'll just start muting my microphone when I'm not speaking.
Okay. I have not heard it yet, but
Okay.
yeah. Okay. So I'll get into these menus in the future here a little bit in more detail, but the menu you want to click on to add a sprite to the bank is this chip menu, this chip and frame icon. When you click it, it expands the menu out,
Right.
and the image to the chip is the image that actually puts it
Gotcha.
into the bank. Oh. It doesn't know where to put it. So let's try that again.
No, origin. Does origin mean a hotspot? Do you need to set a hotspot first?
No. I needed
Oh,
to
there it
actually
goes. Okay.
insert it. I apologize.
Okay.
I hadn't planned on doing that particular item, but apparently, unless you load it from the bank to the image editor,
Right.
it doesn't know where it's from. So if you click on this icon, it tries to put it back into the same location in the bank
Right.
where it came from, and
Gotcha.
it didn't like that I had not previously pulled it from the bank.
Gotcha. So that would be how you would select that particular frame over on the right from the list, and then you could edit it, and then to update it so that it now reflects your new edits, you would click that button. But if you're
Correct.
creating something from scratch, you would click that other thing that will insert it into
Right.
the bank. Okay.
Right,
That makes
exactly.
sense.
All right. This is the load from the bank button.
Right.
So if you have an image you want to load onto the editor, you use that one.
Okay. Can you make one more image that looks different and insert it so we can see that working? Just like make a blue rectangle or something else.
Sure.
All right. Oh, yeah, that's kind of elegant how you can just quickly edit the previous existing frame, but it's not immediately copying over the other one in bank one, I guess you could call it.
Right.
So yeah, that's good, because a lot of times with small pixel art, each frame is just a small modification of the previous frame. So that makes sense. Okay, so now if you wanted to start editing frame one again, you would just click on it over there on the right and then click on load.
Right.
Oh, why
It
didn't it?
tells me that I made a change and haven't saved it. I'll continue
okay.
anyway. And there it
There you
loaded
go.
frame
Okay.
one again.
I'm surprised
I'll
it
make it.
just doesn't automatically update when you click on it. Like, it doesn't look like there's any visual feedback when you select it over on the right. Oh, there. Oh,
It'll
okay, it highlights.
It
Okay,
highlights,
I didn't
and then
see
the
that first time.
the last loaded frame has this star next to it.
Okay,
I'm not sure if double clicking it. Yeah, double clicking it will load it as well.
nice. Okay, very nice.
So I'm going to try to insert a green one in the middle. So I believe the insertion always inserts after the current frame.
Right.
So I want to insert green between red and blue. So I'll select the first frame and select insert again.
Right.
And that did not work. It inserts
On
before.
top. Okay. Is there a way to
So-
change the order easily, or would you have to like manually?
No, it's not a drag and drop, so no, I'd have to remove it. So let's try it.
There you go.
There. Okay.
All right. And what about that? There's a magnify and there's a move icon. and there's an eyeball icon. What do those three do?
The eyeball changes the color of the outlined.
Oh, the interface?
Right.
Okay.
I don't know
Just
if you're
in
seeing.
case, yeah, because if you have an image with a every image you load in will have its own palette, and therefore
Right.
some palettes will make the interface very hard to see. So this redraws the interface with a different color so that you can find a color that works. That's
Correct.
okay.
I don't know what M does. It's toggle, but I can't quite tell.
Huh. Yeah, I wonder. Does that have something to do with memory?
It's possible. Guess I should have had my Amos manual handy here and looked it
that's
up.
all right. Like the basic stuff is obviously the most important. All right, cool. And how do you set a hotspot for an image?
Okay. The hotspot is this little targeting
okay.
icon.
The little James Bond icon.
Yes, exactly. So there's right.
Go ahead.
There's defaults here. You can set the top center, or the top right, and so on.
Right.
Here's right in the center.
Okay. And can you manually draw?
Yes,
Okay.
you can manually move it here. If you go onto the image itself,
and
you can set
left
it.
click to place it down.
Correct. I'm holding the left button down and moving this around, and then when I let go of it, it'll place the hotspot there.
Okay.
And when I save it,
Mm-hmm.
the hotspot will save along with the image.
Right. And one last question about that is, how do you trim any particular frame? So, like you said, each frame can be trimmed to different size.
Right.
Like, let's say you wanted to trim the green one. Okay, so that only affects the particular frame that's being seen.
Right. So let me go back and save it. Oh, I hear the construction now. Excellent.
Yeah.
No, that was not good.
Oh, it saved it over the wrong one.
Yep.
And did undo not work?
Undo did not work.
No, that's a shame. So be careful, anyone that uses this.
Right.
In a lot of programs like this, undo will only undo certain things and not some pretty important things. So save often.
Exactly.
We get the gist of it. You definitely created a trimmed frame, so now we know how to do it. Just got to be really careful when you're reapplying it back over the frame to make sure you're doing it to the same frame you want to.
Correct.
All right. Let me know if that hammering gets too loud so I can, because I have my headphones on.
No, it's not too bad for me.
Okay. Hopefully it's the same for the audience. If not, sorry everyone. Okay.
I'm
cool.
gonna clear.
Yep.
I'm gonna clear this bank and start over.
And show how to.
And I'll show you
how
how we cut this thing. So this is the tool or the menu that does the cutting.
Okay. It looks like the little what were those machines called at arcades and fairs with the robotic arm that would, like the crane thing that would grab
crane.
Grab
exactly.
a plush.
Yes. So earlier you had sent me an image, and I'll try to load that up here.
Which, just so people know, the standard image and animation file format on Amigas was IFF, which I think is interchangeable file format. Is that what it stood for?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
Here it is, Bob's IFF. Beautiful artwork.
Thank you.
So once you load it up here, you can use this little tool to grab anything you want. And I'm just holding down the left button as I move the mouse.
Right.
And just like any of the drawing commands, once I let go of the left mouse button, I then have this thing I can move around, this little tool.
So then you have to click it down one more time to finalize
More
its
time
position.
actually selects it and loads it in the editor.
Nice. I like how it
There-
inverted color, so to guarantee you can see very clearly what you have selected versus what you have not selected.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It has a handy dandy insertion button right here, so you don't have to keep going back and forth, which is nice.
Very nice.
And
then you just click the crane icon again and just grab another thing.
Correct.
So,
yeah.
Cool.
Let me try this explosion. I'll cut a few of these out. And I'll cut them out trimmed as well, so that we can use the hotspot.
Right.
And it automatically advances to the next frame.
Right. One thing I did notice is that what it's doing per frame is it looks like it's rounding up the width to make it probably a multiple of 8 or something.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is necessary for sprites, I guess, but not really for bobs. But I guess.
Right. That's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
Maybe there's a potential optimization for
indeed.
saving memory. Tweak the program so it doesn't round up bob images widths.
Right. I think there is a the Amos manual seemed to speak of Sprite and Bob's interchangeably in a way.
Right.
And I wonder if there was just either a misunderstanding of that, or if
right.
if there is some other reason for it. But
right. I have a feeling because the limitation would be required for sprites, they just left it like that for everything. Because most people wouldn't be any the wiser in when you add different edge cases for different things, then you add all kinds of chances for confusion or human error.
Right.
People would be, like you can have the same bank hold images that you're going to use for sprites or bobs, and then suddenly if you had some trimmed the wrong way for the wrong thing, then you could cause problems in Amos or crashes or trying to use too many sprites for one thing or something. So I'm guessing they just decided to keep it simple.
Exactly.
But okay, that works.
So I have a simple bank here of an explosion sequence and a character.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go over here to the animation button and create a simple animation. This is not that useful in the sense of it won't save your animation to the bank, but it does allow you to sort of preview your animations and see if
your hotspots are in the right place.
Yeah,
really
exactly.
Important. Yeah.
Which they probably will not be in this case.
Poor player is blowing up.
Right, our player is blowing up.
If you didn't take the time to set the hotspot, it's going to be a bit wonky. But can you go after the fact and tweak the hotspot and then?
You can, yes.
All right, well that's great.
So let's do that. I'm going to set it in the center. Actually, I need to load it up.
So basically for each frame you need to load it into the editing frame and then edit your thing and then put it back into that slot, making sure you haven't changed which slot you have selected in the meantime.
Correct. There is a little bit to keep track of. Yeah. And
it's not too bad.
No.
And definitely faster than what I've been doing, which is hard coding the grabbing of all of this in Amos. So in my Amos demo, like probably half the code right now is just loading up the IFF image and telling it with exact left and top left corner and bottom right corners every frame to grab, and then hand setting or manually in the code setting the hotspot for each image. So this is much better than that.
Indeed. It would be nice if there was a more direct way to do this, keyboard shortcuts or
Right, exactly.
some kind of menu toolbar that would allow you to customize some of these. But
right, automating, like being able to turn on something so that it's like as soon as you left click, it's knows you want to edit that particular frame, and as soon as you switch to a new frame, it automatically saves your changes to the frame you just changed. Would save people
Right.
a lot of time. Like I think they were erring on the side of caution to protect people from accidentally changing art they didn't want to.
yeah,
The cost was very high as far as workflow. Just made it much more time consuming. But still
Right.
a lot better, like I said, than hard coding all of this.
and yes, that's true. Eventually, here we'll get ProMotion written in Amos. Right.
Right.
Let's replace this. Okay. So I've set the hotspots. Now let's see if the animation works any better. And it does a little bit.
Yep. You'd have to sort of know what the animation was supposed to look like to begin with, but in general, like as it progresses, it floats upwards, so you would need to move the hotspot lower and lower for each frame. Is it possible to put the hotspot literally below the pixel art? Or would you need to increase that frame to move its hotspot below it? Does that make sense?
That's a good question. I keep hitting that wrong button. It does make sense.
Because I think there's no limit in Amos. If you're hard coding it, I think you could make the hotspot go outside the image, but I don't know if you can in the editor.
So if I
if you do that,
do it manually, it seems to be outside there. Now I wonder if I can set it and move it out. No, I can't move it beyond the.
Oh, there's another potential
dimensions.
improvement that I can.
Yeah,
maybe
right.
I can get someone to.
Yeah,
change
that's a good idea.
Because obviously that's super useful to, and actually necessary, and it would save a lot of memory. I would assume if you're not wasting memory for the image to have a bunch of empty pixels at the bottom.
Right, exactly. So, just to briefly go over some of these other buttons.
Mm-hmm.
This is the quit button, the flag. When apparently you give up, you surrender.
That doesn't seem like you would really save your work, but luckily it does. Or maybe it asks you if you want to save.
Let's see. It does.
Okay,
Object bank is not saved. Continue. No, I don't want to continue.
Okay. So I assume that disk is how you would access load and save. The disk drive,
correct.
I mean. Okay.
Right. This is load, disk pointing to the chip. You can append, so if you have a bank already loaded and you want to add another bank and sort of combine them, you can use this to append a new bank to the current bank.
Okay, so that would mean the bank you have loaded now, you want to load a previously saved bank into it. So it's going from the disk to the memory without, and it's adding it, it's not loading it over. Okay, that makes sense.
This would be saving to a bank you've previously saved to.
Okay, so.
And this would be a save as, like you're creating a new bank.
Right.
And this is what I'd. Hold on.
So, do you have the time, and would you be able to save this, then go into Amos and show how in Amos you would actually tell it to load this bank, and then...
Yeah, I could try that here. Hold on.
And I really appreciate this. Thanks very much. Like I said, I tried to use this recently, and without the manual, and I could not find any tutorial videos that were in English, so it was basically at the time, because my time was limited, it was quicker for me to hard code than it was for me to invest the time to figure out the tool and then do it the proper way. So now I'll be able to do it the proper way. What's going on with the characters?
I don't know. Sometimes I have this problem with my emulator.
Keyboard emulator is like
Keyboard is gone wonky on me here.
It thinks you're
Trying to get
in an alien language or something.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is a valid name or not.
Right.
We'll try it.
I hope you don't have to type the name of the bank to load in Amos. You probably do, right? Because how are you going to recreate that name?
I may have to restart the emulator.
Or maybe you could rename the file in Amos. In Workbench first.
True, yes. Let me see if... Yeah, it doesn't like that name. Sorry about this.
See if you can find any regular character.
Let me try to go back. I'll get out of here and go back. There we go. There it came back.
Oh, nice.
Not done. That's not helpful. It's not reassuring.
Yes. Saying why it was not done is always good.
Yeah, it's not listed there. This is not helpful. Well, maybe I need to resave this because that's what it's complaining about. And now I'll go back and try again.
What does it say? File not found. It's like it.
Yeah, it appended this
loading.
ABK.
It's trying to load. That's why it's saying file not found. I think.
I hope not.
Oh, how weird.
It's definitely not what I wanted it to do.
Yeah, those are confusing icons. But yeah, I guess that's supposed to be save as. It makes sense. But why would it say file not found when you're trying to save something?
I don't know. This is embarrassing.
Oh, why are there two rows there? Is the bottom where you're supposed to type the name, maybe?
That may be. It's been a while, man.
Yeah, try typing the name down there. Not there.
That's probably why it appended the .abk. There we go. Do you want to save it as a Bob bank? Yes. Well, apparently it does distinguish between Bobs and Sprites, which would make sense to optimize that later.
Yeah. So that it's trimmed and not wasting blank pixels on the right-hand side.
So I'll blame all the errors tonight on the fact that it's 2 in the morning here and I'm tired.
Yes. I think we've got similar levels of fatigue at this moment.
I'm going to finally give up on this.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, now you're going to test my memory here.
Amos syntax.
Right.
Memory.
I think it's bank 1 for sprites.
So Bob 1 designates it's going to be the first Bob or blitter object being used, and then 2020 would be the location on screen.
Correct.
20 across, 20 down, and then 3 is theoretically which image from the bank.
Right. That did not go as planned, however.
You don't have to do something first to like reserve the bank or something like that?
The load command should
Automatically do that?
Should do that. Now, what's the command here? I'm so used to like doing tab complete now.
Right.
It's okay. How do the English spell palette?
P-A-L-E-T-T-E, I think. Just one L.
There it is.
Yeah.
Well,
it got the palette.
It got the palette, so there's something there.
Yeah.
So what did I do wrong? I probably have
Oh, interesting.
no.
Do you think maybe you need a do loop just for the sake of? I don't think.
I
that's
don't
the
think
case.
so.
Yeah.
This is definitely
We're
fatiguing.
close. It's definitely loading.
I know.
In the it's loading in the bank. That's good. And you definitely have more than 3 or 4 frames. So unless we're missing a number, that should be the player ship right there.
It should. Let me load a screen. I don't remember how many colors were on that screen. Do you recall?
16 color.
Okay. No. Let's go right dead center. Nope.
The fact that there's a cursor on the screen when it's running is bugging me. Like, would that disappear with the... Or do you have to do something to get rid of the cursor, actually?
Yeah. What is that now?
I really don't remember. Was that it? Oh, yeah, it's gone, but there's still no player object. Well, we don't have to spend too much time on this. I'm sure eventually some other
I'll get
Amos
it here.
user will be watching
Yeah,
this
I'll be
video
like,
and
what are
be
you doing? You're an idiot.
screaming at the screen. But yeah, if you don't have the manual readily available to you, then we can save
have
that
it
for
on
another time.
mine.
But it might take a while to find it, especially with our level of fatigue. But I know it's close. I know there's one simple thing that we're overlooking. It's
Right.
certainly loading the bank and getting its palette. So.
There it is.
There it is. It needed
Bob
an
update. Oh, I've got flashing.
Yep. I think it's just flash off, isn't it?
I think it is.
So what
So
it was
for-
doing is... Oh,
for
go
the-
ahead. You explain it.
Yeah, for the uninitiated, Amos used a double buffer system to try to reduce flashing or, like flickering when it was drawing large bobs. And part of the bob updating system would delay drawing the bob until the back buffer was available. And what would actually update and draw the bobs was a call to this bob update command.
Right. So that would usually be in your loop So like
Correct.
usually toward the end of the loop, after you do all your moving and frame changing at the end before it loops back, you would do bob update. That way it would update all of the blitter objects on screen to match whatever changes have happened in that loop. But
Correct.
I thought you were going to explain what I was going to explain actually was what flash off was. And you
Oh,
can see right here the cursor is changing color.
slashing,
That's
yes.
actually one image that what Amos is doing is just changing the color index
Hmm.
that that particular little cursor image uses on the fly. It keeps changing it, fading from yellow. It looks like yellow, white, and black, or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, so it'll keep doing that even in your game unless you tell it to not do that, and that's what flash off does. Flash off turns that it stops that color index from being changed, and the artwork I did happens to use the same color index somewhere, so that's why you get that flashing. Oh, did you comment out flash off and I didn't see
I
it?
did
Okay,
just to show
excellent.
everyone that
Yep.
it is indeed flashing,
Okay.
and then I'll uncomment that and
So now people also know how to comment out a line in Amos.
right.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for showing me that. That'll really help clean up my code and save me a lot of time in the long run. Hopefully, it'll save some other people that are getting into Emos some time as well.
Indeed.
All right. Well, it's way past it's past 2 a.m. where you are. I don't want to keep you on much longer, and I should get some more sleep too before my day actually begins. So I don't want to take too much longer. Is there anything else you wanted to say or ask? And of course, you're welcome back if you ever want to
Oh,
join in
sure.
on another stream as well, and we can hopefully continue to do updates. I did just want to quickly mention that another thing I want to do pretty soon is start creating little bounties. I think that's what it's called. Basically, put up a little promise to pay certain financial award to any member of the Amiga or Amos community in this case, uh, if they would program either a specific example or a specific tool, or in the case of that object sprite bank editor, maybe add those features we mentioned, like make it so it doesn't add that padding to the right hand side if it's blitter objects,
Right.
or just make the user interface more fast, like get rid of those unnecessary clicks, basically. Those sorts of things. So eventually, I would like to start some bounties for things like that, so that we can start getting basically make it easier and easier for people to make games at a higher quality um, in Amos, and then eventually outside of Amos. And I'll probably save it for another stream since we're both very tired. But
Sure.
I wanted to show the very first prototype ever made of what became Spriter. Was actually made by myself in Fusion, ClickTeam Fusion, on
Oh,
top of my
cool.
day job when I worked as a pixel artist for, at the time, I think that was that Gameloft or Glue Mobile? Anyway, after my day job on nights and weekends, I spent about a year making the prototype of Spriter, which was very much had pixel art in mind. And uh, anyway, I'll show that off next time. You could basically create. It's a modular animation tool. You could create animations by taking separate body part images, assembling them together, just as I showed with the new Spriter. But the difference is you would not, even though my prototype did allow for rotation, typically for an Amiga game, you can't afford to do on-the-fly rotation. So you would just
Right.
swap out images or just move images around relative to each other to create animations. And I'll show that off next time. That's another thing I would eventually love to get support for, because then you could really get many more smoothly animated characters into a game in memory on the Amiga, or like
Yeah.
modular animation is the only feasible way to get really large animated like bosses in your game for a boss fight or things like that. So maybe in the next stream I'll show that off for a little bit.
I look forward to seeing that. That would be excellent.
Yep, and I think I did, but it's probably lost in some dead link years ago. Share a link to the Amiga community of that tool. So I will do that again before I do the so I can link to it during the broadcast. But it's still useful, just like I did with the new Spriter to create pixel art. You could create and save and edit animations in that prototype of Spriter, which, like I said, is very specifically geared toward pixel art. And its data format it saves is just an any text file that is very plain English, since I'm not a real programmer and I like to keep things simple. But potentially that data format could be parsed and sort of translated quite easily to something more optimal for some kind of an Amos extension or something to use to then recreate animations. So you could have a very smoothly animated character actually created out of only a few body part images, but then using that Spriter made data to recreate all of the frames of the animations. So that could be another thing that could really lend to much more impressive and powerful games being done for the Amiga in general, but potentially for Amos specifically.
Indeed.
So, yep.
I think your ideas on making sort of this system to help develop games and to understand, many programmers have moved on to C and assembly in the Amiga community and such, but some, many have not. Mm-hmm. Amos has a lot of potential that I think was not realized back in the early 90s when it was popular.
Right, and that's the other important thing. I mean, keep in mind these tools and these examples, like the translucency trick that I show an example of in Amos. That same exact methodology can be used outside of Amos, and even things like the like any tools that we end up making or adding to the library, they could potentially be used outside of Amos as well. So there's no reason for some actual team with a programmer, they could sort of hijack and use the data from these same tools for a custom coded thing. So yeah, I mean, and I think it's a really important point that a very large amount of people, especially the people very interested in doing an indie game project, are more artists than programmer. And something like Amos is much more attractive because, as I'm sure and as is, it's just the nature of trying to get a team in indie development. There's, there's more flakes out there than, which is not necessarily a sense of irresponsibility or immorality on the case of people that ended up abandoning teams and projects, but it's just the nature of things. People end up with other priorities over time, or so many things can get in the way. And it's really, to me, it's really important as a creative person. Sometimes I get the help of programmers, and sometimes I'll start a project with a small team, but I make sure that the project is basically flake-proof as far as I'm concerned. Like, if I'm the one that started the project, if I conceptually own the project, I make sure that at any point, if it's abandoned, I can take over the project and like program it or make it in Fusion or Amos or something like that myself. So
very wise.
Yeah, it's just otherwise, like I said, I really want every stream I do to hopefully be entertaining and educational and introduce tools, and then eventually, like I'm just giving this prototype of Spriter. I've just shown how the new Spriter can be used. You can get the free version of Spriter from brashmonkey.com. So I just want to keep introducing workflows and tools and techniques that can help people, and especially in the Amiga community. Um, Too many people that end up with the passion and with the know-how to work on a project, everyone ends up reinventing the same sort of wheels, and they'll sort of code everything from scratch. And
Right.
I really want to get some sort of community-wide cooperation going, so that like these tools and these examples, so that eventually there's entire engines, like a really nice solid parallax scrolling platformer game engine that
Mhm.
uses all of these tools, like a level editor and a sprite bank editor, or spriter for the animated characters. So then suddenly someone can make a completely new game just by changing the sound files, the music files, the spriter animations, the tile images, and like using a map editor to create new levels. And then it would
Mhm.
simply be a matter of going in and changing variables which control how high does this particular character jump, how fast is their inertia, all of that stuff. And it would
Yeah.
allow people, like, even on a superficial level, they could make a whole new game just by changing the art. But then they could dig deeper and go in and change the code if they want to make a drastically different game.
Sure.
So that's definitely some stuff I will also introduce in the future, which particular project I want to sort of make as a community-wide project, where I'll keep working on the project even if no one else ends up touching it. I'll keep adding to it, but it will also be always readily free and available for other people to use, to copy the code. Not the artwork, because I don't want to work on a bunch of artwork and try to make a game that I'll hopefully eventually get some kind of compensation for. I don't want other people using my art before I do.
Sure.
And yeah, but as they would have to replace the art. But the point is, they could completely just take and use the code either directly or as an example to learn from.
Right.
So, anyway, that's sort
Well,
of the
if you
short term, like that stuff, the starting bounties, and doing starting to do a community wide, or at least open to the community. Hopefully people will start contributing to the core engine and the tools, but if not, at the rate I can go, at least there'll be more and more examples, and eventually entire engines for people to be able to use to make legitimate retro games.
excellent. If you don't mind, would
Yeah.
you do you have a few moments? I'd like to just give a little teaser, I guess, about what we have planned,
Yeah,
and what
that
I
would be
guess what I
awesome.
personally have planned for Amos. And I think I showed this to you. Let me share my screen again.
Okay.
I showed you the other day when we were talking.
Right. I'll tell you when the screen is actually sharing. Here it
Okay.
comes. Okay.
That I've spent a lot of time recently developing a oh, something is different about this. Okay, there we go. Developing sort of a cross-platform development environment for Amos, because honestly, in the 20 plus years since I developed on the Amiga,
Right.
things have changed, editors have changed, and just my comfort level has changed.
Right. Just to be clear, you're talking about for working on the actual code to Amos itself, not
Correct.
like this is not something that an Amos user could use to make Amos made games instead of using the Amos editor. This is actually for people that want to improve Amos itself, like you are doing.
That's correct.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
Just making sure.
Yes.
Understand. Okay.
So, for those who are interested in the Amos development, particularly the people who are over at the Amos Professional Facebook page or at the Amos Factory, they may be curious about what I'm up to. I've spent several weeks recently going through the code, setting up a new build system. The old build system that Francois made worked only on the Amiga, and it was basically using Amiga scripting language to run the DevPack2 compiler, or assembler, I'm sorry. And that works great. But for me, I'm more comfortable these days in Linux, and I feel that it has some more tools that I could use. It's just easier for me to make the transition from my work environment to then moving over to working on Amos.
Yeah, so not only can you work much more comfortably with the code itself, but when you're ready to compile, you can compile it right from your comfortable modern environment, and then just put the final compiled executable into your Amiga emulator, and you now have your new build of Amos.
Correct,
Yeah,
exactly.
much nicer.
So I had to port some of Francois' custom tools that he had written in Amos to compile Amos. And so I had to rewrite them in C, because C is just the language I'm most comfortable with. And once I got those written, I now have the ability to build Amos on Linux, and I'm using the VAssem assembler. I don't know what the V stands for, honestly, but this is an excellent cross-platform assembler that allows me to assemble the Amos sources on Linux and assemble them and link them so that I have a standalone executable for the Amiga that I can, as you said, just copy over to the emulator and give it a try.
Right. So you said this development, right, like this sort of code editor that's on your screen right now, you said this is cross-platform, so someone that's comfortable in Windows can run this on Windows as well, or?
This is the Vim editor. So Vim was originally developed on the Amiga, so if you're old school, you
could even do it on an Amiga.
Right. But this is more advanced, obviously, in Linux. It's been developed for many years. But these editors are not anything I've worked on exactly. What I've worked on here is what's in this particular editor here, this make file.
I understand that part. I'm just wondering, like you said, you're working in Linux because you're comfortable working in that. I'm just trying to clarify or understand if someone can do this also from Windows, or if they need to be
certainly.
From... Okay.
I apologize for misunderstanding. But
yeah, no problem. One caveat of dealing with me is, although I understand a lot of concepts, because I'm not actually a programmer or very technically minded, I'll sometimes use slightly wrong terminology. So that can definitely cause some confusion.
So as a sort of a roadmap of where I see things going, as I said earlier, the Amos factory has a few people working on this, most notably myself and also Bruce Uncle, as his handle is known on the Amos factory. He's been the main coder for many years. He's working on adding some cool features like syntax highlighting to Amos, as well as an updated help system.
And this is to the actual Amos editor, so people like me that are Amos users will really be able to benefit, because they'll see in real time in the editor when they're making a syntax error or things like that.
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly.
And what did you mention besides syntax highlighter?
The help system in Amos. Right. Bruce has been working on making it more robust and updated, more useful, I guess, for various purposes. So those are some of the features that we want to get out in the next release. I suppose the first official Amos factory release.
Awesome.
Beyond that, I intend to begin working on the compiler. Looking again at the compiler, like I said, my day job is a compiler designer. So I intend to go look at Francois' compiler code, Not that I don't trust him, but the state of the art has changed a little bit, and we'll see if maybe we can get a little bit better code generated from the compiler. I know in the past that's been one of the complaints some people have had about Amos, being that, it doesn't generate great code, or it's not fast enough, or whatever.
I do know in general that it does still, like, typically if you make a game in Amos, when you compile it, it will run faster and smoother to some extent than when you're previewing it in Amos directly. So any additional improvement would obviously be fantastic.
Right. So my goal is to, hopefully make it just more efficient.
Right.
I'm not sure how that'll look yet, but beyond that, there are a couple extensions I'd like to try to add in. One of them being a like a data type extension, if you will. One thing that Amos lacks is the ability to add containers in a more traditional programming language. I guess that's what they're called, like trees and vectors, heaps, queues, things like that. So if you are dealing with certain enemies, you can sort of sort them into various containers.
So, for example, all enemies can be hit by the basic attack. They just might react slightly differently, or you might remove a different number of hit points. So if you put all of the enemy types into one container called hittable, then you could do all of your code in Amos versus hittable, instead of having to make separate code for each different type of enemy. So
correct.
Yeah.
Right. You could loop through all the contents of a container and apply a certain transformation to them.
Right. Or collision detection.
Move them, collision detection, that kind of thing. Right. Correct. So that that would make it more intuitive from a modern programmer's point of view.
Yeah, and certainly, not only intuitive, but much more efficient, much more organized code. And obviously, one thing that can lead to a nightmare for a developer is the need for a lot of copy and pasted code, like for different, for each enemy or whatever. Then you end up with, you have a bug in one enemy, now you have to fix it and then re-copy and paste it and change whatever little changes you had made for each enemy.
Correct.
That's no fun.
That's no fun at all.
Time consuming.
AGA is on the list, of course. Everyone's been clamoring for AGA for quite some time, and there are some issues that make it more difficult than I anticipated to put an AGA in, but hopefully we can surmount those.
Like I know, just like with the support for CD32 controllers, like people had hacked ways to do it, where you have to add a low-level library, and in the code you're actually doing like peeks and pokes or something to check for the button presses. So obviously having built-in is button 4 pressed is drastically better for a developer. To just make as pleasant and intuitive a development system for the creative person. I know some people have already hacked some different types of AGA support. There's something you can do to get it to support 16 color playfields into playfield mode instead of 8 per playfield, which obviously is a massive improvement. But with that caveat, obviously if you use AGA features, then your game, of course, it'll still run on anything that can emulate an Amiga, because pretty much every platform can emulate a powerful Amiga, like an AGA Amiga or beyond. But as far as the classic hardware goes, obviously if you use any of those features, then it'll only run on the newer those AGA Amigas and not the Amiga 500s and 1000s.
Right.
But yeah, that's really cool stuff.
And then beyond AGA, some of the items that you talked to CodeTapper about, and that you and I have discussed recently too, the repeating sprite trick.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Perhaps an editor of some kind to create rainbows automatically, or
that's
some kind of
a bounty on.
copper scripting tool similar to Amos in a way. I don't know if that's doable or not, but that's an idea that's gone through my head here.
Right.
The joysticks, and basically anything else that comes up as useful to this project that you have would be an excellent addition to Amos.
Right. And I think you had mentioned something that might or might not be feasible or difficult, but you had mentioned the concept of, what was it? Was it called inline blitting? That's something that you might want to explore.
Right. This was interleaved
Bitmaps,
bitmaps, right, that allow a one call to the blitter to completely blit an object, as opposed to having to split it up into multiple blits per.
If I can explain it to laymen or artists, like the Amiga used what's called bit planes for blitter objects. And the way it worked was, if you only needed basically two color, like on or off, basically, one bit plane could do it. You would have basically two color, a background color and a foreground color with one bit plane. And then every time you added a bit plane, it doubled the number of colors. Do I have that right?
Yes.
So basically what you're doing is you're stacking how many sort of passes through the blitter has to take in order to get the final full color version of whatever it is. So if you only have a two color image you're blitting, if you're using like color index 0 and 1, for example, then you only need to blit that, or draw. Blit means draw, basically, that one bit plane. But if something is four color, now the blitter has to draw the entire image with the first bit plane and then the entire image again, basically, or at least the parts of the image that use those higher up color indexes, to give you the final four color image drawn on the screen. So basically what interleaving does is you still have to draw to all those bit planes, but it does it all in successive order from one big piece of memory, instead of having to sort of load in each bit plane one at a time, I think. Is that the case? Keep in mind you're still screen sharing, just in case. I don't want you to forget and like show any passwords or anything.
No, that's all right. Okay. Exactly. What the bit plane blitting would do, as you described it, blitting one at a time, you'd have to set the blitter up and give it the information
for that
where
one
to start blitting and how, that one plane. Now, with some creative arrangement of the way the data for the images is stored in memory, you can actually sort of stack the bit planes instead of on top of each other, as it were, conceptually. In memory, you can draw one line, horizontal line, say, that contains the information for bit plane 1, and then the very next horizontal line in memory, not on the screen, would contain the data for bit plane 2, and repeat that for each bit plane. This would allow the blitter to only need to be set up one time to blit as many bit planes as you want. So it saves time in setting up the blitter. The time of actually blitting is probably the same, but the setup time can be significant for the blitter. So
that's really
I don't believe Francois used that concept in his
I can't imagine that was sort of standard operating procedure back then, and especially for someone, which I think Francois admitted that he was fairly new to the Amiga when he made Amos. And while he did overall a fantastic job, he didn't say that, I'm giving him the credit he deserves, but while he overall did a fantastic job, there are some things he admitted that he wishes he had been a bit more knowledgeable at the time, and could have theoretically made Amos a little more flexible or a little less restricted, like in the case of the sort of rainbow copper color changing tricks per raster line. Amos only allows you to change one color per scan line, for example, whereas the actual Amiga is capable, like under the hands of a good programmer, you could change virtually every color index per scan line,
Right.
depending on the situation. So,
Yep.
yeah, that's exciting stuff. It's also really cool. Like I've heard for so many years in the Amiga community, and in fact, it used to irk me that so many people in programmers, in fact, in the Amiga community would sort of poo-poo the blitter chip because it could have been done better or more efficiently, and especially for later models of the Amiga, you can basically blit faster with more custom blitting routines using the processor as opposed to the hardware dedicated in the Amiga for blitting.
Yes.
But I always would remind people, yes, that might be completely true, but it would still be kind of silly to ignore that whole other processor dedicated to
Indeed.
doing that task. So obviously the best thing to do is use the blitter until you've maxed it out and then use the processor in these more advanced things. Otherwise it's just going to be sitting there doing nothing. And
Right.
no matter how much weaker, it's like if you've got two people carrying logs or something, and one person is only half as strong as the other person, it's still a massive improvement, and it takes a huge workload
Right.
off of that stronger guy. He'll have to take like a third less trips, basically,
Exactly.
with that other person. So it doesn't make sense to throw away and pretend the blitter doesn't exist, especially on the old Amiga, where I don't think that's the case. In the original
Right.
like OCS Amigas, I think there's still a massive
Correct.
benefit to use the blitter as opposed to blitting with the processor, or especially only the processor. But like that's what excites me is apparently this is potentially a way to optimize at least a part of the blitting while still using the actual blitter processor that's dedicated to blitting, as opposed to going, oh well, to get this optimization we have to do it with the processor and ignore the blitter.
Right.
So that's exciting. Like I think Power Bobs was an extension made for Amos that
Yes.
does all the blitting, I think, with the processor.
I'm not sure if it does all of it, but yeah, it
Right.
does. I believe it does use the processor for at least part of the blitting.
Right. Well, it would be cool if it used it for part of the blitting, but to me, it would be a shame. I mean, it's cool if you're using some Power Bobs and some regular Bobs for optimal performance. But if people are working on an OCS Amiga and they use Power Bobs only, and if they were only being done with the processor, like I'd be frustrated that they have a whole chip dedicated to blitting that
Right.
they're ignoring, and their overall game performance is going to suffer because of that. But anyway, this is very interesting stuff to us, and maybe to other
Yes.
Amos users, but I have no idea how many other people are now asleep, especially in your time zone.
Yes, right. I suppose it is about time.
Yeah, should let you go, but I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope some other people did as well.
Likewise.
I really appreciate it. I will, once I learn how, I will trim out, if with your permission, I will trim out the part where you actually showed how to use the Amos bank editor and put that up on YouTube.
Sure.
Because like I said, I could not find a single English language tutorial for how to use it, and I think that'll really help encourage more people to get the most out of Amos and maybe to use it in general. But anyway, yes, thank you very much. Thanks so much for staying up so late.
No problem.
And I had a
Thank
great
you,
time.
Mike, for what you do and for doing these Twitch feeds. These are amazing. I've enjoyed every one of them so far, and it's a pleasure to be on your show.
Thanks. Well, I hopefully they'll get better and better, and hopefully I didn't make a big mistake. I'm reassured that you said that you did hear yourself before we started this stream, because that's
I did,
that's a
yes.
nightmare in the back of my head. Is we'll go
Yes,
through a whole
yes.
night stream, and then the actual broadcast
The
will
audio is
have,
gone.
like no audio on at least on one side of the conversation. But
Oh, no.
if that happens, I'll just stay up all night writing a script from memory and dubbing in your voice.
No, we'll have to do it again.
Yeah, hopefully that's not the case. I certainly don't think so, but
Alright.
anyway, that's the good thing once you get an actual live audience. So I need to find that sweet spot of when the right time is to do the broadcast so that we start getting a live audience. And over time I think it'll become more popular, but obviously having an actual live audience that can tell you these things when they're going wrong will be very reassuring.
Yes.
But anyway, yeah, I will let you go. Thanks again so much for taking the time for this, and I'll be back. Everyone else that watches, I'll be back soon. I want to start doing more than one stream a week for sure, and we'll get there eventually. But I need to tie up a few other loose ends before I can dedicate that level of time. All right, thanks again very much, Mike. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thanks everyone. I'm going to sign off now.
All right. Goodbye.
All right.